I was halfway through a routine shift when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Nothing urgent, no alerts, just a message. I didn't check it right away because that's how work is when you're serving, you finish what's in front of you first. When I finally stepped into a quiet hallway and glanced down, I saw my sister's name on the screen. Kendra. The message was short. "We're done with you. Don't ever try to contact us again." That was it. No explanation. No build-up. No question mark. Just a full stop on a relationship that had existed my entire life. I read it twice, then a third time. Not because I didn't understand it, but because my brain was trying to decide whether this was real or some kind of mistake. People don't usually end families over text messages. At least that's what I'd always believed. I typed back, then erased it. Typed again. Erased that too. I locked my phone and stood there for a moment staring at a wall I'd walked past 100 times before. Everything around me kept moving like nothing had happened. People passed by. Radios crackled. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed. I unlocked my phone again. The message was still there. I tried calling her. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. I sent a short text. Just one sentence. "What's going on?" It didn't deliver. I checked my contacts, my signal, my settings. Nothing was wrong on my end. I was blocked. That's when it hit me that this wasn't impulsive. This wasn't said in anger and sent too fast to take back. This had been decided. The wording made that clear. We're done. Not I'm upset. Not I need space. We're done. I stood there longer than I should have. Long enough for someone to ask if I was okay. I nodded and said yes, because that's the automatic answer when you're in uniform. You don't unpack personal things in hallways. You compartmentalize. You do your job. So I went back to work. That night I read this message again. Then I tried my parents. No answer. I tried my mom's cell, then the house line. Nothing. I sent an email. It didn't bounce back, but it didn't get a reply either. By morning I realized I'd been blocked there too. This was the moment when most people would panic. I didn't. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because panic doesn't get you anywhere. I was still on active duty. I was still responsible for other people's deadlines, decisions that mattered. Whatever was happening back home would have to wait whether I liked it or not. That was the part that hurt the most. Not the message itself, but the timing. I was serving far from home following orders I didn't get to negotiate, and someone had decided that was the perfect moment to erase me. Kendra and I had never been close in the easy sisterly way people like to talk about. We grew up in the same house, but we moved through life very differently. She stayed close to home, married early, built her life around being present. I left, joined the army, learned how to live out of a duffel bag and keep my personal life small enough to fit in my pocket. For years, that difference had been framed as a choice. "You're always gone," she'd say. "Someone has to stay." It was never said with humor, more like a score being kept. Still, I'd never imagined she'd draw a line like this. Over the next few days, I learned just how complete the cutoff was. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years sent me a brief message asking if I was okay. That was it. No details, no explanation. When I asked what she meant, she didn't respond. Later, I found out she'd been told not to get involved. That was new. That wasn't just family tension. That was control. I replayed the message in my head more times than I care to admit. The phrasing bothered me. "We've decided." It sounded formal, committee-like, like something drafted, read out loud, and approved before being sent. It didn't sound like my sister talking off the cuff. I wondered who the we really was. There were a dozen things I wanted to do. Fly home. Confront her. Demand answers. But wanting something doesn't mean you're allowed to do it. I couldn't just leave my post. I couldn't pull records or make calls on government time for personal reasons. Military rules are very clear about that. Personal issues wait until orders are complete. So I waited. Waiting doesn't mean doing nothing. It means paying attention. I started noticing small things. A change in how often extended family checked in. A missed update about my dad's health that I found out about days later through someone else. A bill notification forwarded to an old email address instead of mine. Each thing on its own didn't mean much. Together they formed a pattern I didn't like. I considered the possibility that I'd done something unforgivable without realizing it. I went back through conversations, visits, holidays. Nothing stood out. No big argument. No blow-up. Just distance that had always been there, quietly expanding. Late one night, I opened the message again. Same words, same punctuation, same finality. I didn't feel angry reading it anymore. I felt something colder, a sense that this wasn't about emotions at all. This was about decisions being made while I wasn't there. The next morning, I put my phone away and got dressed like any other day. The routine helped. Boots on, uniform straight, hair secured, everything in its place. Whatever was happening back home, it wasn't going to derail the responsibilities in front of me. But as I walked out, the thought stayed with me, steady and unresolved. People don't cut someone off this completely unless they believe they won't need them again, and that belief usually comes from somewhere. I slid my phone into the bottom drawer of my desk and locked it, not because I was done thinking about the message, but because I wasn't going to let it sit in my hand all day like a live wire. Work had a way of forcing decisions. You either stayed functional or you became a problem someone else had to manage. By noon, I'd already forgotten to eat. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how quiet my phone stayed. No follow-up. No, we should talk. No apology sent too late. Silence has weight when it's intentional. I kept my head down and finished what needed to be done. Meetings, reports, the kind of decisions that don't wait for personal crises. People depend on you showing up the same way you did yesterday. That's the deal. You sign up for it. You don't get to renegotiate it when life gets messy. That night after the bass quieted down, I went for a walk. Not far. Just enough to burn off the edge that hadn't gone away. The air was dry, the light steady, the kind of night where nothing dramatic happens unless you bring it with you. I didn't. I stopped under a light, pulled my phone back out, and checked my blocked list. Kendra's number was there. My mom's too. I stared at the names longer than I needed to. There's a particular kind of calm that settles in when you realize the door isn't just closed, it's locked from the other side. I tried to think practically. That's what training does to you. You assess. You list facts. Fact 1, I was deployed. Fact 2, I had no emergency orders to return. Fact 3, whatever this was, it wasn't being framed as an emergency by the people who mattered back home. That last one landed harder than I expected. I sent a short email to my dad's old account. Just checking in. Hope you're okay. Nothing confrontational. It didn't bounce back. It also didn't get a reply. That's when the idea that this might be coordinated stopped feeling paranoid and started feeling accurate. Over the next week, little things shifted. A family group chat I hadn't muted went quiet. A holiday planning email thread I'd always been included on disappeared from my inbox. I found out through a third party that my dad had a doctor's appointment I hadn't known about. Not because anyone forgot to tell me, because no one planned to. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Families fall into patterns. People assume the person who's far away doesn't need updates. That's normal. Or at least it can be. Still, the phrasing of that message wouldn't leave me alone. We've decided. It sounded like a verdict, not a feeling. Decisions get made when options are weighed, when outcomes are considered, when someone benefits. Kendra had always been good at that part. Staying close, being present, being useful in ways that were visible. I'd been the opposite. Gone for months at a time. Hard to reach. Always promising to visit and then rescheduling because something came up. Over time, absence starts to look like abdication to people who value proximity more than consistency. I understood that. I'd lived it. What I didn't understand was the urgency. If this were just resentment, it would have surfaced earlier. There would have been warnings, passive-aggressive comments, awkward phone calls. This was clean, surgical. I called a friend from back home, someone who wasn't family but had known us long enough to read between the lines. She answered on the second ring and went quiet when I asked if everything was okay. "Who told you?" she asked. "No one," I said. That's the problem. She hesitated, then said she didn't want to get in the middle of anything. That was when I thanked her and hung up. You don't need details when people start protecting themselves. The shape of the truth shows up anyway. I spent the next few days doing exactly what I was supposed to do. No angry messages, no calls I wasn't authorized to make, no favors asked. Military life doesn't leave much room for improvisation, and I wasn't about to risk my position over a family conflict that might still be salvageable. That word salvageable did some heavy lifting for a while. I convinced myself that distance would cool things down, that Kendra would reach out once whatever she was dealing with settled, that this was a boundary being clumsily enforced, not a permanent erasure. It was easier to believe that than the alternative. Then an automated notice popped into my inbox from a financial service I hadn't checked in months. Nothing alarming, just a routine alert that a contact preference had been updated. Not by me. I checked the account. The access wasn't gone, just changed. Notifications redirected. Paper statements requested. It was subtle, legal. The kind of thing you do when you want information to flow one direction. I sat back and stared at the screen. There are plenty of benign explanations for that. Shared accounts get reorganized all the time. But paired with everything else, it felt less like housekeeping and more like a curtain being drawn. I considered escalating, asking questions through official channels, but that would have crossed a line. I couldn't use my role to sort out personal affairs, and I wasn't about to blur that boundary. The consequences of that kind of mistake don't stay personal for long. So I did what I could do. I documented what I noticed. Dates, messages, changes. I didn't act on any of it. I just made sure I could remember it clearly later. The days moved on. Work stayed busy. My phone stayed quiet. I stopped checking it as often because there was nothing new to see. The message didn't hurt the way it had at first. It settled into something flatter, more resolved. That's when it occurred to me that being cut off wasn't the same as being irrelevant. It just meant decisions were being made without my input. And in my experience, decisions made in the dark tend to look very different when the lights come back on. I finished another late shift, turned off my monitor, and locked up for the night. As I walked back to my quarters, the thought stayed with me. Steady and unwelcome silence can be a strategy, especially when someone thinks you won't push back. I hadn't pushed back. Not yet. I refreshed my inbox out of habit while standing in line for coffee thumb moving before I'd fully decided to check anything at all. Most of it was work. Schedules, confirmations, the usual noise. Then I saw an email thread I recognized immediately, not because of the subject line, but because my name wasn't on it. It was a family email. I could tell by the way it was written. Casual updates, dates, a tone people only use when they assume everyone reading already belongs there. The message had been forwarded to me by mistake, likely by someone who hadn't realized I was no longer supposed to see it. It mentioned my parents, a medical appointment, a follow-up. Nothing dramatic, but I had not been told any of it. I read the message twice, then checked the timestamp. The appointment had already happened. A week earlier. No call. No text. No just keeping you in the loop. I wasn't even an afterthought. I closed the email and stood there longer than necessary, holding a cup I hadn't paid for yet. When the person behind me cleared their throat, I stepped forward and completed the transaction like nothing had changed. Back at my desk, I opened a document and started a list. No labels, no assumptions, just facts. Date, message, omission. It wasn't dramatic enough to be suspicious on its own, but it wasn't nothing either. That afternoon, another detail surfaced. A billing notification came through for an account I shared with my parents. Not a charge. Just a confirmation that statements would now be mailed instead of emailed. That change had required authorization. Not mine. I logged in. Access was still there. Nothing had been locked. Nothing illegal. It was almost elegant in its restraint. Whoever had made the change didn't want to alert me. They just didn't want me to see things in real time. I thought of Kendra immediately, then stopped myself. Jumping to conclusions doesn't help. You verify first. You observe patterns. You don't accuse without evidence. Still, the timing was hard to ignore. I reached out to an aunt I trusted, someone who had always been direct with me. I kept it light. Asked how my parents were doing. She answered quickly, said they were fine. then added a line that stuck with me. Kendra's been handling most things lately. Handling. Not helpings. Not assisting. Handling. I thanked her and ended the conversation without pushing. The more I asked, the more obvious it would become that I was trying to get information I'd been cut off from. That kind of pressure only makes people defensive. Instead, I watched. Over the next few days, the pattern filled in. Decisions were being made, appointments scheduled, documents signed, all of it happening in the open but just out of my reach. No laws broken, no rules violated, just a steady narrowing of who was included. It was effective, and it was deliberate. What bothered me most wasn't the control. It was the confidence behind it. Kendra wasn't acting like someone worried about being questioned. She was acting like someone certain there would be no challenge. That kind of certainty usually comes from leverage. I checked my voicemail that night and found an old message from my mom left weeks earlier. It was brief. She sounded tired. She mentioned Kendra had been taking care of paperwork so I wouldn't have to worry while I was away. I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to it again. The tone wasn't strained. It was relieved, like a problem had been solved for her. That realization settled uncomfortably. This wasn't just about me being excluded. This was about someone stepping in and making themselves indispensable. I typed out a message to my mom, then stopped. There was nothing I could say that wouldn't sound accusatory or desperate. And desperate people don't get invited back into decision-making rooms, so I deleted it. Instead, I pulled up my leave schedule. Still weeks out. Nothing flexible. Nothing I could accelerate without triggering questions I wasn't ready to answer. The Army doesn't care about family politics. It cares about timelines and responsibilities. I respected that. I'd built my career on respecting it. The next sign came from a place I hadn't expected. A notification from a service my dad had used for years, something I'd helped set up when he wasn't comfortable online. The login had been updated. New recovery email. Not mine. I checked the activity log. Everything had been done properly. Permissions granted. Access transferred. Clean. Someone had thought this through. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't impulsive behavior. This was preparation. Quiet, methodical, and designed to look like support. I wondered how long it had been going on. Before the text, before I left, or had my absence simply made it easier? That question stayed with me through the evening and into the next day. I went through my routine. Work, meetings, decisions that mattered to people who would never know what was unfolding behind the scenes of my own life. I caught myself almost admiring the efficiency of it. No confrontation, no accusations, just a slow shift of gravity until everything naturally fell in one direction. That direction wasn't toward me. Later that week, I received another forwarded message, this time from a cousin who clearly hadn't realized I was no longer on the approved list. It referenced the plan going forward. No details. Just an assumption that everyone reading was aligned. I wasn't aligned. I wasn't even present. I closed the email and added another line to my list. The thing about lists is that they don't argue with you. They don't minimize or exaggerate. They just exist. And once enough items are on them, it becomes hard to pretend you're imagining patterns that aren't there. I didn't feel angry. Not yet. Anger clouds judgment. What I felt instead was something closer to clarity. A sense that whatever had started with that text message wasn't about emotional boundaries at all. It was about control being consolidated while I was unavailable to contest it. That evening, I skipped the call I usually made home out of habit. There was no point in dialing numbers that wouldn't be answered. I cooked, cleaned, and reviewed my notes instead. Dates, names, changes that seemed small until you lined them up side by side. By the time I shut off the lights, the picture was clear enough to be unsettling. I wasn't being pushed away because I'd done something wrong. I was being managed out because it was convenient. And convenience, I'd learned, often looks a lot like kindness right up until it doesn't. I stared at the list on my screen and told myself I was overreacting. Families get messy. People step in when someone's gone. That doesn't automatically make it a conspiracy. It makes it practical. I'd seen worse over holiday dinners. So I stopped adding to the document, not deleted it, just closed it. That distinction mattered to me at the time. I decided the smartest move was restraint. No accusations, no legal consultations, no escalation that would turn a strained situation into a permanent fracture. I told myself I'd deal with it in person when I was back. Face-to-face conversations fix things texts can't. That's what people say when they want to believe there's still a way back to normal. Work helped with that belief. The days filled up. Deadlines pressed. I stayed busy enough to convince myself the distance was temporary. That this was a cooling-off period, not a restructuring of my entire place in the family. Then I missed something I shouldn't have. It was a voicemail from my mom that came in while I was in a briefing. By the time I saw it, hours had passed. The message was upbeat, almost cheerful. She said Kendra had taken care of some paperwork so I wouldn't have to worry while I was away. She said it like that was a gift. I didn't call back right away. I should have. Instead, I let the tone of the message reassure me. If my mom sounded calm, things couldn't be that bad. That assumption cost me time. 2 days later, a letter arrived at my parents' house. I didn't see it, obviously. I only learned about it later after the fact when someone mentioned it in passing like it had been routine. It wasn't routine. The letter involved a change in how certain decisions would be handled if my parents were unavailable. Temporary authority. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would raise alarms. The kind of thing people sign when they want fewer headaches. My name wasn't on it. That was the moment I should have acted. Instead, I hesitated. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was rushed. Maybe they assumed I wouldn't want the responsibility while I was away. Maybe Kendra had framed it as helping me, not replacing me. That framing mattered. Kendra was good at it. She didn't demand control. She offered relief. I chose not to question it immediately because questioning it would have meant admitting I was already sidelined, and I wasn't ready to accept that yet. So I waited. In the meantime, I sent a neutral message to my dad. Asked how he was feeling. No mention of documents or decisions, just a check-in. He replied hours later, said he was tired, said Kendra had been a big help lately. He didn't ask how I was doing. That part stung more than I expected. The next sign came quietly. An online account I'd helped manage years earlier sent me a notification that access settings had been simplified. That was the word they used. Simplified. Less clutter. Fewer people involved. It sounded helpful until you realized who was no longer included. I logged in. Still had access. Still could see everything. But alerts were off. Permissions reduced. I could look up, but I couldn't change. That was new. I sat back and finally reopened the document I'd closed days earlier. Read through the list from the top. Dates, omissions, small changes that had seemed reasonable in isolation. Together they told a story I didn't want to believe yet. I'd made an assumption early on that this was emotional. That hurt feelings were driving decisions. That once tempers cooled, things would reset. But the choices being made weren't emotional. They were logistical. Someone had decided it was easier to move forward without me. I felt stupid for not seeing it sooner. Not because I lacked intelligence, but because I'd wanted to be generous. I'd wanted to give my sister the benefit of the doubt. I'd wanted to believe proximity was the only reason she was stepping in. That generosity had a cost. By the time I started paying closer attention, certain doors had already closed. Not slammed. Just shut quietly with the kind of politeness that makes them harder to reopen. I checked my leave options again. Still nothing immediate. Still no clean way to drop everything without creating problems I couldn't explain. The Army doesn't operate on vibes. It operates on documentation. So I documented. This time I didn't stop. I wrote down everything I could verify without speculating. Messages received. Messages not received. Changes confirmed. Changes implied. I didn't label anything malicious. I just recorded the sequence. The more I wrote, the clearer it became that my absence wasn't a complication. It was a feature. I caught myself thinking for the first time that Kendra might not see this as temporary at all. That she might see this as a correction. A rebalancing. Someone had to be in charge and I wasn't there. That thought settled uncomfortably, but it also explained a lot. Late one night, I drafted a message to Kendra. Nothing confrontational. Just a request to talk. I read it over twice, then deleted it. Reaching out now would have put me on the defensive, asking for access that had already been taken. I wasn't ready to ask for anything. I wanted to understand what had already happened. The next morning, I woke up with that same list in my head, the one I'd tried to ignore earlier. The difference was that now I wasn't trying to explain it away. I was looking at it for what it was. Not a misunderstanding, a transition. And transitions, I'd learned, don't pause just because the person being moved out hasn't caught up yet. I stood at the baggage claim with my hands wrapped around the handle of my duffel, watching it circle the belt for the third time before it finally came into view. Travel always felt anticlimactic after long stretches away. No parade, no announcements, just people grabbing their things and moving on. I didn't tell anyone I was coming home. That wasn't a test or a strategy. It was simply the cleanest way to arrive without triggering a performance. I wanted to see things as they were, not as they were staged for me. The drive from the airport was familiar enough to feel strange. Same exits, same gas station where I used to stop every time. The radio played a song I recognized but couldn't place in time. Everything looked unchanged, which made the silence from my family feel louder. I didn't go straight to my parents' house. Instead, I checked into a small hotel a few miles away. The kind designed for people who don't plan to stay long. Neutral space. No expectations. I dropped my bag, washed my face, and sat on the edge of the bed with my phone in my hand. Still blocked. I let it go. That evening, I drove past my parents' place, not to stop, just to see. The lights were on. A car I didn't recognize was in the driveway. Kendra's. She was there doing what she'd been doing for months now. Being present. I didn't pull over. I didn't slow down. I kept driving until the house disappeared in my rearview mirror. That was the first real choice I'd made since the message. Not to confront. Not to demand answers. Just to observe. The next morning, I met with someone I trusted professionally, not personally. A former colleague who'd transitioned into a civilian role and understood both sides of the fence. We had coffee in a place where no one knew either of us. I kept it general. No names, no accusations. Just a hypothetical about family members making decisions while one person was unavailable. He listened, nodded, and said something that stuck with me. Intent matters less than impact, he said. And timing tells you everything. That matched what I was seeing. I asked about boundaries. What I could look into without crossing lines. What counted as personal versus professional. He was clear. I couldn't use my position to influence anything back home. But I could protect myself. Document, consult, ask questions as a private citizen. That distinction mattered. I didn't call Kendra after that. I didn't call my parents either. Instead, I requested copies of records I was legally entitled to. Nothing confrontational, just standard requests. Some came back quickly, others didn't come back at all. The delays were informative. By midweek, I'd pieced together enough to confirm what I'd suspected from afar. Kendra wasn't improvising. She had stepped into a role and made it look seamless. Bills paid, appointments managed, decisions framed as temporary solutions. Temporary solutions have a way of becoming permanent when no one challenges them. I stopped by my parents' house later that week while Kendra's car was gone. I knocked. My mom answered, surprised but pleased. She hugged me tightly and said how good it was to see me. She didn't mention the message. Neither did I. Inside, everything looked the same. Same furniture, same pictures, same routines. The only difference was who was making the calls. My dad looked tired. Not sick, just worn down. He thanked me for coming by, said Kendra had been handling a lot, so I wouldn't have to worry. He said it like he was trying to reassure me, not realizing that reassurance wasn't what I needed. I listened more than I talked. At one point, my mom mentioned paperwork she'd signed recently. Nothing serious, she said. Just things to make life easier. I asked what kind of things. She waved it off, said Kendra had explained it all. That was enough. I didn't ask to see the documents. I didn't push. Pushing would have made me the problem. Instead, I nodded and changed the subject. We talked about neutral things. The weather, the neighbors, a show my mom liked. When I left, I hugged them both and said I'd stop by again soon. I didn't say when. Back in my car, I sat for a minute before starting the engine. The urge to confront hit hard then. To walk back and demand clarity force a reset. It would have felt satisfying in the moment. It also would have been ineffective. Kendra's advantage wasn't malice. It was proximity. She had context. She had trust. And she had already positioned herself as the solution. Confronting her without preparation would have made me look disruptive, not protective. So I didn't. Over the next few days, I met quietly with people who knew the system. Not to accuse anyone, but to understand what options existed if things went further than I was comfortable with. I learned about thresholds, about what counted as overreach versus assistance, about how easily the line between help and control can blur when everyone assumes good intentions. I also learned that waiting too long can be just as damaging as acting too fast. That balance stayed with me as I moved through the week. I kept my interactions light, polite, normal. I didn't let on that I was paying closer attention now. Kendra texted once a neutral update about my parents like nothing had happened. I replied with a simple thank you. That response told her what she needed to believe. By the end of the week, I had a clearer picture of the landscape. Not enough to act yet, but enough to stop doubting my instincts. This wasn't about family drama or bruised egos. It was about control settling into place while everyone else was busy being relieved that someone else was handling it. I drove back to the hotel that night with my phone face down on the seat beside me, aware of how quiet everything felt when you chose not to fill the space with confrontation. Silence. I was learning could be restraint, and restraint, when used deliberately, could buy time without giving anything away. I set my keys down on the hotel desk and spread the papers out beside them, aligning the edges the way I'd learned to do before inspections. Order helps you think, especially when the information in front of you doesn't want to be seen all at once. The first thing I noticed wasn't what was there. It was what wasn't. Certain names were missing. Mine specifically. Not erased, just quietly excluded. Authority hadn't been transferred outright. That would have raised questions. Instead, it had been rerouted. Temporary permissions, conditional access, the kind of arrangements that look reasonable until you read the fine print. I'd scheduled a consultation that afternoon with a civilian attorney recommended by someone who understood both military life and family law. No drama, no accusations. I framed it as a review. Can you tell me what this actually does is a very different question than, is this illegal? He read silently for several minutes, flipping pages without reacting. That told me more than any immediate response would have. When he finally looked up, his expression stayed neutral. This isn't fraud, he said, and it's not forged. But it's not nothing either. That was the gray zone I'd been circling from the beginning. He explained it plainly. Power of attorney had been granted for specific tasks, not general control. Medical coordination. Financial logistics. Nothing permanent. Nothing irreversible. On paper, it looked like support. In practice, it created a bottleneck. Information flowed through one person. Decisions passed through one filter. My sister. Does this remove me completely, I asked. No, he said. It just makes you irrelevant unless you push back. Irrelevant. There it was again. He leaned back and folded his hands. The issue isn't what she's done so far. It's what this setup allows her to do without resistance. That distinction mattered. No laws broken meant no immediate remedy. But it also meant something else. She was operating on the assumption that I wouldn't challenge it, that I wouldn't know how, or that I wouldn't want to disrupt the peace by doing so. All three assumptions were useful to her. I asked what would trigger concern. He didn't hesitate. Patterns, documentation, evidence of intent to exclude rather than assist, especially if it results in financial or medical decisions that limit someone else's rights. I nodded and slid my list across the desk. He scanned it, then added a few notes of his own. Dates lined up. Changes clustered. Nothing dramatic, but nothing accidental either. She's careful, he said, which tells me she expects scrutiny eventually. That surprised me. I'd assumed the opposite, that she thought she'd never be questioned. But careful people don't act out of confidence alone. They act because they're planning for contingencies. On the drive back, I thought about how long she'd been setting this up. Months at least. probably longer. It wasn't about urgency. It was about positioning. That evening, I checked in on my parents again. This time, Kendra was there. She greeted me warmly like we hadn't missed months of communication, like there hadn't been a message cutting me off entirely. She talked, a lot, about appointments she'd scheduled, bills she'd handled, stress she'd relieved. She didn't brag. She performed competence. It was impressive in a way, and dangerous. I asked a few neutral questions. Not challenges, clarifications. She answered easily, confident in her command of the details. She didn't ask for my input. She didn't need to. At one point, she mentioned how hard it must have been for me to be away during all this. The tone was sympathetic. The subtext was final. I smiled and agreed. When I left, she hugged me and said she was glad I trusted her. That word again. Trusted. As if trust were something she'd been granted, not something she was earning. Back in my car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine. I replayed the conversation not for what was said, but for what wasn't. There had been no invitation, no acknowledgement that I might want to be involved. Just updates delivered as conclusions. I didn't confront her about the documents. I didn't mention the attorney. There was no advantage in revealing that I'd stepped outside the frame she'd built for me. Instead, I made a choice. I stopped trying to reinsert myself emotionally. No more checking in out of habit. No more asking questions that would be filtered. I shifted to observing outcomes. Who signed what? Who authorized changes? Who benefited from decisions being streamlined? That shift changed everything. Within days, more details surfaced. A contractor scheduled without my knowledge. A financial adjustment explained as simplifying things. A medical update framed as already handled. Each instance reinforced the same truth. My sister wasn't reacting to a crisis. She was managing a system. And systems don't like interference. I met with the attorney again to clarify my options. Not to act yet, but to understand what leverage looked like in practical terms. He was clear. As long as I stayed within civilian channels, documented everything, and avoided emotional confrontation, I remained in a strong position. What about family dynamics? I asked. He gave a half smile. That's not my department. But I can tell you this. People who consolidate control quietly don't appreciate public challenges. They rely on things staying polite. Polite had become my default. That night I reviewed everything again. The list had grown, not explosively, steadily, like a ledger filling up, line by line. Nothing that would shock an outsider. Everything that would matter to someone paying attention. I closed my laptop and looked around the room. Neutral walls, standard furniture, temporary space. It struck me then that Kendra had been building permanence while I'd been living out of a bag. That didn't make her wrong, but it did explain why she'd moved the way she had. The difference was that permanence once questioned has to justify itself. I turned off the light and lay back the outline of the situation finally clear enough to stop second-guessing my instincts. This wasn't about drama or misunderstandings. It was about authority being claimed through access. And access once documented could be challenged without ever raising my voice. I answered Kendra's next message with a thumbs up. Not literally. I typed, "Got it. Thanks for handling that," and hit send. It was short, neutral, and exactly what she expected from someone who'd accepted their new position in the background. The reply came quickly. A paragraph this time. Details. Reassurance. A tone that assumed agreement without needing confirmation. She'd slipped into it naturally, like someone settling into a chair they believed was theirs. That's when I stopped correcting anything. When updates came through secondhand, I didn't ask follow-up questions. When decisions were mentioned after the fact, I didn't challenge the timing. I nodded. I thanked. I stayed pleasant. Politeness, I'd learned, is often mistaken for consent. The effect was immediate. Kendra relaxed. She started sharing more, not less. Not because she needed my input, but because she wanted acknowledgement. People who believe they've won like to narrate their success. They want witnesses, even quiet ones. At my parents' house, she spoke freely about plans, adjustments, improvements, everything framed as efficiency. I stayed seated at the kitchen table and listened while she stood pacing slightly as she talked, already comfortable occupying the center of the room. I didn't interrupt. When she referenced paperwork, I asked general questions, the kind that sounded curious rather than skeptical. She answered easily. Dates, names, processes. She had nothing to hide, at least not from someone she believed wouldn't act on the information. My parents watched us with visible relief. 2 daughters in the same room. No conflict, no tension. That mattered to them more than who was actually making the decisions. I let that matter too. In private, I continued documenting. Not emotionally, methodically. Each instance went into the same format. Time, action, impact. No adjectives, no conclusions, just facts. Over time, the pattern sharpened. Kendra was expanding her role incrementally. Not grabbing power all at once, but accumulating it through repetition. If she handled something once, she handled it again. If she handled it twice, it became hers by default. No one questioned it because it worked. That's the danger of competence. It justifies itself. At one point, she mentioned how much easier things were now that everything went through one person. She said it casually, like it was a compliment she'd given herself without realizing it. I smiled and agreed. Inside, I made a note. I stayed away from confrontations intentionally. Not because I was afraid of one, but because confrontation would have shifted the narrative. It would have turned me into the obstacle. As long as I stayed cooperative, the story remained that Kendra was simply filling a gap. Gaps are easier to close than battles are to win. I also knew that if I challenged her too early, she'd tighten control. Careful people get more careful when they feel watched. I didn't want that. I wanted her comfortable. So I let her be. I returned to work without ceremony. No announcements, no declarations. From the outside, it looked like I'd come home, accepted the new arrangement, and gone back to my life. That was the version Kendra repeated to anyone who asked. She's busy, she'd say. She trusts me. Trust is a powerful word. It disarms people. It made others less likely to loop me in. Why bother someone who had already delegated responsibility? That suited me. Over the following weeks, the consequences of that assumption became clearer. More decisions were made without consultation. More boundaries shifted. More access concentrated. None of it illegal. None of it dramatic. Just consistent. I noticed something else, too. Kendra stopped checking whether I was okay with things. She informed rather than asked. The transition from coordination to authority was complete. At a family gathering, someone joked that she should be paid for how much she was doing. Kendra laughed and said she didn't mind, that she was just stepping up. I watched my parents smile with gratitude. No one looked at me. That invisibility was useful, because while Kendra was narrating her role publicly, I was building a record privately. I wasn't collecting dirt. I was collecting structure. Understanding how the system she'd built functioned, where it relied on assumptions and where it could be challenged cleanly. One evening, she mentioned a financial adjustment that would streamline things even further. She explained it confidently, glossing over details that would have mattered to someone paying attention. I asked her to repeat one part like I hadn't quite followed. She did slower this time, clarifying a point she'd assumed I wouldn't care about. That clarification went straight into my notes. Another time, she forwarded an email thread with an instruction already drafted, asking me to sign off so it could move forward. It was framed as a courtesy, a formality. I replied that it looked fine. I didn't sign anything. She didn't notice. The more she assumed compliance, the more latitude she gave herself. She stopped copying people unnecessarily. She summarized instead of attaching. She spoke in conclusions. That was the moment I knew she believed there was no opposition left. I kept my demeanor consistent, calm, cooperative, slightly distant. The kind of person you stop worrying about because they're no longer unpredictable. Predictability is comforting. It makes people careless. At night back in my own space, I reviewed everything with fresh eyes. The list had become substantial enough to tell a story on its own. Not one of villainy, but of process. Step by step. Decision by decision. It wasn't emotional. It was procedural. That distinction mattered because procedures can be audited. I thought back to the original message, the one that had started all of this. The bluntness of it. The certainty. At the time, it had felt like rejection. Now it felt more like clearance. She hadn't just cut me off emotionally. She'd cleared the field. And because she believed I'd accepted that role, she no longer bothered to check whether I was still paying attention. I was. I just wasn't announcing it. I printed everything and spread it across the hotel bed, not because I needed to see it all at once, but because I wanted to know how it felt to look at the full shape of it. Papers have weight when they're real. Emails, timestamps, forwarded messages, authorization notices, summaries that replaced originals. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just enough to show consistency. I sorted them by date first, then by category: medical, financial, administrative. The order didn't change the facts, but it changed how clearly they spoke. Patterns are easier to hear when nothing is shouting. Once the structure was clear, I stopped guessing. Guessing invites doubt. Documentation doesn't. I scheduled another meeting with the attorney, this time with specifics. No hypotheticals. I laid out the sequence and let him read without interruption. He didn't rush. He didn't skim. He took notes in the margins, occasionally flipping back to confirm a detail. "This is solid," he said finally. Not in the way people expect, but in the way that holds. He explained what I already suspected. This wasn't about proving intent through a single act. It was about showing a trajectory, gradual exclusion, centralized authority, decisions made easier by removing dissent rather than addressing it. "It's clean," he said. "That's what makes it risky for her." Risky because clean records don't need interpretation. They just need context. I asked what the next step would look like if I chose to move forward. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked me a question. "Do you want this to stop, or do you want it corrected?" There's a difference. Stopping something creates resistance. Correcting it exposes imbalance. I told him I wanted accuracy. Nothing more, nothing less. He nodded. "Then you let her keep doing exactly what she's doing." That matched my instincts. I didn't change my behavior after that meeting. If anything, I leaned into predictability. Polite responses. No challenges. Occasional acknowledgments that reinforced her confidence. Kendra continued operating under the assumption that I'd accepted a supporting role. In return, she continued generating evidence. She forwarded summaries instead of full documents. She spoke for my parents without confirming their preferences. She authorized adjustments on their behalf that streamlined processes but narrowed oversight. Each choice made sense on its own. Together, they told a clear story. I kept everything. I also started speaking to one other person. Quietly. Not to rally support, but to establish perspective. An aunt who'd always noticed more than she said. I didn't accuse Kendra of anything. I asked neutral questions about how decisions were being made. Her answers were careful, but her tone shifted. She mentioned moments where she'd felt excluded too. Small things. Updates that came late. Plans that were already set by the time they were shared. I didn't press. I didn't need to. Shared observations don't require agreement to be useful. At the same time, I checked my own exposure. Made sure nothing I was doing could be framed as interference. No unauthorized access. No pressure on my parents. Everything stayed within civilian channels, documented and appropriate. That discipline mattered. The moment emotions enter the process, credibility leaves. Kendra remained relaxed. She talked freely about how much she was handling, how relieved our parents were, how complicated things had been before everything was centralized. Someone had to take charge, she said once, not defensively, but with the casual certainty of someone stating a fact. I agreed. She didn't notice the pause before I did. By then, the record was complete enough to stand on its own. It showed not just what she'd done, but how she'd framed it. Helpful, necessary, temporary. Until temporary became routine and routine became assumed. I stopped adding new categories. There were enough already. Any more would have been redundant. Instead, I reviewed the sequence again from the beginning. The text message, the silence, the rerouted access, the steady consolidation, the absence of consultation. It read less like a family conflict and more like a transition plan. Transitions require consent or resistance. I'd provided neither openly. That ambiguity had worked in my favor. One afternoon, Kendra called to update me on a decision she'd already made. She spoke quickly, confidently, as if reciting a checklist. When she finished, she asked if I had any questions. I said no. There was a brief pause on the line, not long enough to be awkward, just long enough to register. She filled it by explaining why the decision was best for everyone. I thanked her for letting me know. After the call, I wrote down the time and content, then closed the file. The story didn't need embellishment. It had reached the point where repetition was doing the work for me. That evening, I walked through the city near my hotel, not to clear my head, but to confirm it was clear already. The situation no longer felt personal. That shift was important. Personal conflicts escalate. Structural ones resolve. When I got back, I emailed the attorney and asked him to prepare a formal summary. Not a demand, not a warning, just a factual outline of the current arrangement and its implications. He replied that night, "I'll have it ready." The next morning, I checked my phone and saw a message from Kendra. Another update, another decision, another assumption that nothing had changed. I replied the same way I always had. Calm, neutral, brief. She didn't suspect anything because there was nothing emotional to react to. No anger, no pushback, no visible shift in tone. That's the mistake people make when they confuse silence with surrender. Silence, when it's deliberate, is just space. Space to observe. Space to prepare. Space to let someone reveal exactly how far they're willing to go when they believe no one is watching. By the time I closed my laptop and got ready for the day, everything that needed to be documented had been documented. Not because I'd rushed, but because I'd waited long enough for the pattern to finish drawing itself. Nothing had exploded. Nothing had stopped. The system she'd built was still running, and that was exactly what made it ready to be examined. I set my phone face down on the table before anyone arrived, not because I didn't want to see notifications, but because I didn't want to look distracted. If this was going to happen the right way, I needed everyone focused on what was actually being said, not what they assumed was about to happen. The living room filled slowly. Chairs pulled closer. Coats folded. Familiar voices settling into familiar patterns. My parents sat side by side, my mom holding a mug she didn't drink from. Kendra took the armchair across from them, already positioned like she'd been there longest. She smiled when she saw me, a polite, controlled expression that suggested nothing out of the ordinary. I waited until everyone was seated before speaking. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't clear my throat. I just started talking the way I would in any professional setting where clarity mattered more than volume. I asked everyone to come because I want us all operating from the same information. Kendra nodded immediately. "That's a good idea," she said. "Transparency is important." That word again. I acknowledged it with a brief glance and continued. "I'm not here to accuse anyone of anything I said. I'm here to correct a few assumptions." That got her attention. Not enough to interrupt, but enough to lean forward. I began with facts, dates, actions, changes that had occurred while I was away. I didn't describe them as wrong. I described them as real. I referenced documents I'd requested and received. I mentioned decisions that had been made without consultation, not to shame, but to establish sequence. As I spoke, I watched reactions, not faces. Shifts in posture, changes in breathing. The moment my mom stopped nodding automatically. The moment my dad looked at Kendra instead of me. Kendra stayed composed. She waited. When I finished laying out the timeline, I paused. Not dramatically, just long enough for the room to register that this wasn't a complaint. It was a report. "I want to be clear," I said. "Nothing I'm describing is illegal. That's not the point." Kendra relaxed slightly. She took that as confirmation she was still in control. "The point," I continued, "is that these decisions weren't temporary. They weren't emergency measures. They were structural changes that assumed I would no longer be part of this process." That was when she spoke. "You were gone," she said calmly. "Someone had to step in." "I agree," I said. Stepping in wasn't the issue. She crossed her legs and waited for the rest, confident enough not to rush me. "What matters," I said, "is what happened after you stepping in became stepping over." The room went quiet. Not tense, just attentive. I reached for the folder beside me and slid a single page onto the coffee table. Not toward Kendra, toward my parents. "This is a summary," I said, "prepared by a civilian attorney. It outlines exactly how authority has been consolidated, what information is now routed through one person, and what assumptions that setup relies on. Kendra leaned forward to look. Her expression didn't change, but her hand stopped mid-gesture. I didn't ask for this meeting to take control back, I said. I asked for it so everyone here understands what the current structure actually does. My dad picked up the paper and read it slowly. My mom watched his face. It centralizes decisions, I continued. It limits oversight. And it only works if everyone believes there's no alternative. Kendra laughed softly. Are you saying I shouldn't help anymore? No, I said. I'm saying help doesn't require exclusivity. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. The pause was brief, but it was new. I was told you didn't want to be involved, she said. I was told you decided I wasn't needed, I replied. Those are not the same thing. My mom finally spoke. I thought you trusted Kendra. I do, I said. That doesn't mean I consented to being removed. That landed differently. Trust versus consent. The distinction settled into the room without needing emphasis. Kendra straightened. This feels unnecessary, she said. Everything's been running smoothly. That's exactly why it matters, I said. Smooth systems don't reveal their weaknesses until something changes. She turned to my parents. I was trying to make things easier for you. I know, I said, and I appreciate the effort. But ease shouldn't come at the cost of transparency. I pulled out another page. This one stayed in my hands. This outlines how decisions will be handled going forward, I said. Nothing dramatic. Shared access. Clear communication. No single point of control. Kendra's smile tightened. You prepared this already? Yes, I said, because preparation prevents misunderstandings. The attorney's name at the bottom of the page caught her eye. I didn't point it out. I didn't need to. My dad looked between us. Is this necessary? He asked. It is if you want everyone involved to stay involved, I said, including me. That was the moment the dynamic shifted. Not because of anger or raised voices, but because the underlying assumption had changed. I wasn't asking to be included. I was stating that I already was. Kendra exhaled slowly. You could have said something sooner. I did, I said. I was told not to contact you. The room went still. That sentence didn't accuse. It reminded. She looked at me sharply, then away. I didn't expect this to turn into a legal discussion, she said. It isn't, I replied. It's an accuracy discussion. I placed the document on the table and leaned back. No one here did anything malicious. But intentions don't override outcomes. My mom reached for the paper and read it herself. She didn't look at Kendra when she finished. I didn't realize, she said quietly. That was enough. I didn't press further. I didn't demand apologies or concessions. I let the document speak. I let the structure be seen for what it was. Kendra gathered her composure quickly. She always did. She nodded and said she wanted what was best for everyone. She said she'd gone too far without realizing it. She framed it as a misunderstanding. I didn't contradict her, because what mattered wasn't how she described it. What mattered was that the structure had been exposed, and everyone in the room now understood how it worked. We talked logistics after that. Adjustments, access restored, communication clarified. The tone stayed calm. Professional even. No one stormed out. No one raised their voice. By the time people started standing up and gathering their things, the room felt different. Not resolved, but realigned. As everyone left, Kendra paused near the door. She looked at me, searching for something in my expression. I met her gaze and nodded once. Neutral, polite. When the door closed behind the last person, I picked up my phone and turned it face up on the table. It stayed silent, not because nothing had changed, but because everything that needed to be visible finally was. I rinsed the mug I hadn't finished and set it upside down on the rack, listening to the water run longer than necessary. The house had emptied out without ceremony. No slammed doors, no speeches in the driveway, just people leaving with their coats on, carrying a little more information than they'd arrived with. I didn't follow anyone outside. I wiped the counter, straightened the chairs, and put the folder back into my bag. When everything looked the same again, I sat down and let the quiet settle on its own. Kendra didn't text that night. Neither did I. There was nothing left to clarify. The structure was visible now, and structures don't argue back. Over the next few days, changes happened without drama. Access was shared again. Notifications resumed. Updates came directly instead of through summaries. It wasn't a reversal so much as a correction, like adjusting the alignment on something that had drifted. Kendra stayed involved. She didn't disappear or withdraw. She just stopped being the only gate. The difference was subtle but decisive. When decisions were made, they included more than one voice. When updates went out, they went out to everyone. My parents seemed lighter, not relieved in the way people feel when someone else takes over, but steadier, informed. They asked my opinion again, not out of obligation, but because they remembered I had one. I went back to work without announcing it. The drive to the airport felt different this time. Not because the road had changed, but because I had. I didn't carry the same tension with me. There was nothing unresolved trailing behind the way there had been before. At the base, routine picked up where it had left off. Briefings, schedules, decisions with real consequences. The kind of work that doesn't care about personal victories or losses. That consistency was grounding. A week later, Kendra sent a message. Not an update, not a directive, just a question about something small. I answered it. We kept it simple. We weren't close. We didn't need to be. The text that had started all of this stayed on my phone. I didn't delete it. Not out of spite, but because erasing it would have implied I needed to forget it. I didn't. It had done its job by revealing what words can do when they're chosen carefully. I thought often about the moment I'd almost confronted her without preparation. How easy it would have been to turn this into a loud argument that went nowhere. How tempting it had been to demand my place back instead of documenting why it never should have been taken. The difference mattered. Quiet action doesn't feel like revenge when you're doing it. It feels like restraint, like patience, like letting someone finish building the thing they'll eventually have to explain. That explanation never came in the form of an apology. I didn't expect one. People rarely apologize for systems that benefited them. They just stop using them once they're exposed. My relationship with my parents improved in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not because we talked more, but because we talked better, clearer, without assumptions, without someone else translating. I also learned something uncomfortable about myself. I'd assumed distance made me expendable. That absence invited replacement. The truth was simpler. Absence creates opportunity, and opportunity gets taken by whoever is closest. That doesn't make them villains. It makes them human. What mattered was how that opportunity was used. I didn't tell anyone at work what had happened. There was no reason to. Family issues don't earn medals, and resolving them quietly doesn't need witnesses. The people who needed to know already did. Over time, the sharpness of the situation dulled. Not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer demanded attention. The system ran as it should. Shared, transparent, boring. Boring is good. Every now and then someone would mention how impressed they were with how everything had been handled. I nodded and changed the subject. Impressing people wasn't the goal. Accuracy was. The irony wasn't lost on me. The text that cut me off had been written to remove me from the equation. Instead, it clarified exactly where I stood and what needed to change. Distance didn't make me powerless. It just required a different approach. I still serve. I still leave for stretches of time where I can't be reached easily. That hasn't changed. What has changed is the understanding that my absence doesn't equal consent, and my silence doesn't equal surrender. The next time a decision is made while I'm away, it will be documented, shared, and explained. Not because anyone fears consequences, but because the expectation has been set. That expectation is the real outcome. Family revenge stories usually end with confrontation or collapse. This one didn't. It ended with a correction that stuck, because it didn't rely on emotion to hold it together. I didn't win anything in the way people usually mean when they talk about winning. I didn't take control away from my sister. I made control visible. Once it was visible, it couldn't hide behind good intentions anymore. That's what changed my life. Not the message, not the silence, not even the meeting. It was the realization that being underestimated isn't a weakness if you're willing to wait long enough for someone to show you exactly how they're operating. When they do, all you have to do is let the facts speak in a room where everyone can hear them, and then go back to your life knowing it's finally aligned the way it should have been all along. Sometimes the biggest shifts in family drama don't come from yelling ultimatums or walking away. They come from staying steady long enough to see what's really happening and being prepared when the truth finally has nowhere left to hide. This wasn't about punishing my sister or tearing my family apart. It was about reclaiming clarity, boundaries, and respect without losing myself in the process. Family revenge stories don't always end with chaos. Sometimes they end with quiet control and a life that finally feels balanced again. If stories like this resonate with you, real family drama, quiet revenge, and moments where underestimated people take their power back, subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming, and you won't want to miss the next one.